Michael Vonnen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore Channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in the US it is Thanksgiving week. And in light of that, and the fact that Christopher Tolkien has apparently produced his last contribution to his father's legacy with The Fall of Gondolin, I thought it was a good time to kind of take stock of what we have to be thankful for from the lives of J.R.R. Tolkien and, by extension, Christopher Tolkien, who published posthumously a great deal of his father's work. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the reasons that I am particularly thankful for J.R.R. Tolkien's work. First off, I would like to point out that Tolkien, along with a handful of other people, are basically responsible for giving us the revival of the fantasy genre as a respected genre in literature. By the time Tolkien and some of his cohorts like Lewis came around, fantasy and fairy stories were more or less relegated to the nursery. They weren't really considered the type of thing that you would write for an adult audience. And yet with The Lord of the Rings, and to a lesser extent Lewis with the Narnia series and things of that nature, fantasy became a legitimate genre again, such that we now have many different authors writing in the genre. You have George R.R. Martin, Brandon Sanderson, lots of different names you could come up with, many of whom I'm not even aware of because there are just so many of them now. But before Tolkien, most authors wouldn't be caught dead writing in the genre, at least for anything older than an adolescent, and probably not even an adolescent. So we definitely get that to be thankful for J.R.R. Tolkien's work, because The Lord of the Rings almost single-handedly catapulted fantasy back into the realm of legitimate genres for fiction. Related to that, to a degree, is Tolkien's use of invented language. He wasn't the only one who used invented language. There are other authors who did invented languages in their own way. Most of them, though, were not systematic in the way that Tolkien was. I mean, for example, you could imagine Lewis Carroll coming up with all kinds of strange words for poems like Jabberwocky and things of that nature, but it was never a systematic effort to create a language with a grammar, really delving into the root words and that sort of thing. Tolkien is really the only person that I'm aware of up to his time to have done that. Since Tolkien, of course, we have many authors, and not only authors, but people in the movie and TV genres putting out invented languages. You can imagine, for instance, Klingon in the Star Trek universe, the Dothraki language in George R.R. Martin's Song of Ice and Fire series, and there's probably others I'm not aware of, but the point is, Tolkien is really the one who kind of got that trend going, and it's not ubiquitous, but it does appear, and it does lend a little extra aid to the suspension of disbelief in a world-building type sense, because it gives you the idea that this really is an alien or foreign or past culture with its own language, its own customs, that sort of thing. Whereas if you just make up words and try to put them all together, it doesn't really have the same effect. So those two things, I think, kind of go together in terms of Tolkien's contribution to modern fantasy and, to a lesser extent, sci-fi as well. And so that's the first thing I would mention to be thankful for. Now let's talk about some other stuff. Staying in the same vein, but spurring off into a slightly different direction, is again, going into the world building aspect, but Tolkien's creation of Mithril and things like that, and how all of his work kind of leads into the invention later on of tabletop RPGs and later on, of course, video game RPGs. I never really played tabletop RPGs. That was a little before my time, and I grew up without enough geeky friends to really play that. So mostly I was into the RPGs on video games, which that was more or less my favorite genre in video games. I don't play video games nearly as much anymore, but when I did, that was definitely among my favorites. And if you play video game RPGs for any length of time, you will run into at least one where Mithril is an element used to make weapons or armor or something like that. So Tolkien obviously contributed heavily to the creation of these types of games, and they're definitely something that I enjoy. So, and part of that is because of, again, the world building, but I wanted to bring this up separately because it goes way off the literature into a totally separate medium of entertainment. But RPGs, you really get to take on the life of somebody in a totally different world, totally different setting, and that's kind of what you can do in fiction, but in an RPG, you're actually kind of acting it out, and so it's a totally different experience. So that's another aspect in which I am very thankful for Tolkien's work overall. Next up is the quality of Tolkien's writing itself, and I mean that in two different senses. There's the aspect of just the prose and poetry style that Tolkien writes in, and there's also the fact that the knowledge base that he refers to and uses in his writing, and which you can explore to understand better what he's writing, is just immense. And so you can always come back and find something new. So, for example, you read The Lord of the Rings over and over and over again, and you'll always catch something new. And then you can listen to somebody who's really studied up on Tolkien and the sources that he had to work with, and you can learn even more. You can learn places that, the sources he used to develop some of his stories. You can get ideas of the philosophical ideas he was using to import into his stories, all this sort of thing. There's endless sources you could go into in terms of different authors who have taken looks at Tolkien's philosophy, his ethics, his politics, just anything you can imagine almost, and finding how he incorporates that into his stories. As far as the prose and poetry style, obviously he's not the only person whose style I enjoy, but I do enjoy his style more than just about anybody else. And particularly when it comes to poetry, it wasn't until I read Tolkien that I really started to appreciate poetry. Before that, a lot of the stuff that you get in English literature class, just wasn't really a fan of most of it. Tolkien, though, because it's a narrative and it's an epic, for the most part, he's even when he's not giving you an epic narrative in a poem itself, the fact that the setting is such that it's within that context makes it a little more enjoyable for me and gave me a little more impetus to really appreciate it. And of course, if you're familiar with the Silmarillion and the History of Middle-earth series, then you'll know that Christopher Tolkien published the Lays of Beleriand, where he produced the beginnings, because Tolkien never finished, but the beginnings of the epic poems that were supposed to be some of the major stories in the Silmarillion saga. And some of those are just absolutely gorgeous. They go on for pages and pages and pages before Tolkien finally just couldn't continue them for one reason or another. But they're amazing poetry, and it's astounding that he managed to carry them on as long as he did and still keep up the same exact poetic structure throughout. So those are ways in which I really appreciate Tolkien's writing in and of itself, because you can always come back and enjoy it again and again, learn something new, and really just soak in the amazingness of his writing style. Now, of course, I can't go without mentioning Christopher Tolkien a little more, because, as I mentioned in the previous segment, he did bring to light a lot of material that Tolkien never published during his lifetime. We get, the Lays of Beleriand, we get lots of pre Lord of the Rings material. We get the Silmarillion itself, and frankly, a lot of people don't enjoy the Silmarillion, but the Silmarillion, even if you don't enjoy it, does provide a huge amount of backstory and lore to explain references in the Lord of the Rings that's very useful. So even if you don't read it, it's helpful to know the material at some basic level. So the fact that Christopher Tolkien brought that to light is also amazing. He's put out many other things that were never published, or just were kind of part of the workings but never made it to the final form or into the final story. There's bits and pieces in the History of Middle-earth that don't really fit into the narrative per se, but give us a really interesting view into Tolkien's thought processes, how he was looking at his invented world in relation to ours. Just lots of different material there. And he's also published The Unfinished Tales and some other pieces of work that Tolkien was never ever able to publish during his lifetime that also give us a lot more information. And some of it's just the world building and richness involved is just absolutely incredible. So the fact that Christopher Tolkien has dedicated his life to bringing so much of this material to light and publishing it is just, that in itself is a huge feat, and it's definitely one that I am very thankful for. Finally, the last thing that I will mention in terms of what I'm thankful for as far as Tolkien is the multimedia spin-offs of his work. So we've got, mini movies, video games, board games, you name it. There's tons of stuff out there to entertain yourself with besides the actual writings themselves. And I kind of grew up watching the Rankin Bass cartoons of The Hobbit and The Return of the King. I also saw several times the Ralph Bakshi, which we never owned, but I definitely did see it several times, Lord of the Rings movie. And then more recently, of course, the Peter Jackson movies. And while I don't really care for the Hobbit Peter Jackson movies, and I have my issues with the Lord of the Rings movies, to me, the Lord of the Rings movies by Peter Jackson as movies are among the best that have ever been made, and it's perfect for a day-long marathon. There's not a whole lot of movies or movie trilogies that you can really marathon and it just kind of perfectly fits in one day as one cohesive story. So that's one element of it. There's also board games, video games, and all that sort of thing. I've reviewed some board games on this channel. Some of them are very complex, some of them less so, but I find immense enjoyment in most of them. And of course, video games. There's lots of video games out there. I haven't played a lot of Lord of the Rings video games because many of the better ones have come out really since I stopped playing video games seriously. But I have played some of the older ones and enjoyed those as well. So just the immense amount of material that has been produced, as adaptations of Tolkien's material, that's plenty to go on by itself. So, and of course, I'll keep adding to that in this channel as well. So I'll eventually do reviews of more board games and even some video games and that sort of thing. So that's my reasons for being thankful for Tolkien. So those are the reasons that I am thankful for the life and work of J.R.R. Tolkien. If you have any other ideas for things to be thankful for Tolkien, then please do list them in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, then please do give it a like and share it around. You can also follow me on Twitter at JRRTLore, or you can subscribe by clicking the button over here. And you can also find 2 of my previous videos here. Until next time, I'm the Tolkien Geek, signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namaste.